All right, this is our outstanding graduate speaker block. This is Lily.
Yes.
And she will be giving a presentation on gender. Okay. All right, thank you so much.
Just really briefly, let me know, this was for the cross-cultural trauma and recovery course. So often what we asked people to do, and I'm sorry, I'm running in and out trying to find something else.
I think that I can just
Okay, so is to ask the faculty who proposed these papers for this award, which is an award that is given to papers that have been evaluated by the entire faculty of the department, to briefly introduce the paper, if I might ask. Or Professor Young to do that, please.
Really worked on discussion of what happened in Argentina. So she was not only recounting disappeared in Argentina, but then she went further and looked into the literature and the theoretical aspect about how ordinary people knew what was going on, but to know what was going on would put them in danger. So they blocked it out, and that's this idea of gender and repression that made you aware of what's happening to this woman, you know, but if you were to speak of it, there would be consequences for you. And so people have this repression that is between your ears. It's, I suppose today in they're colonialized, there's going to be years to make it not hard to work. But she took what was an individual situation, specific situation, and then allowed the reader to see universal aspects of this. So what are we not seeing in our lives? What are the areas which are too dangerous for us to know, for us to speak about? And that's why I thought it's not only well written, but it was anthropological and universal. So,
yes. Thank you. So as has been said, I'm Lily. I wrote this paper on gender and repression in Argentina's last dictatorship as part of ANTH 490, cross-cultural trauma and recovery. So as Lance said earlier, this is kind of a heavy topic. So if you're not comfortable with that, that's super fine and you don't have to listen. But yeah, let's get into it. This has kind of become part of some ongoing research of mine. I am currently working on my capstone for the Honors College, which is going to be on precepticide in memory in Argentina's Parque de la Memoria, which is a park dedicated to commemorating victims of state terror. So I have made some modifications to this kind of like to reflect that like ongoing work of mine. So if you have seen my work from last quarter, it might be a little bit different, but still going along the theme of gender and repression. So in this presentation, I will focus on the image of a disappeared man or desaparecido in Spanish, Jorge Julio Lopez, which was altered as a form of activism to call attention to continuing injustice and lack of visibility regarding victims of state terror. Sorry. Oh, I got it. Okay, so as a former Spanish colony in South America, Argentina is a largely Catholic mixed race country with strong ties to its people's European heritage, specifically in Spain and Italy. In 1976, a military coup led by that guy, Jorge Rafael Videla, overthrew the government of Argentina and established a civilian military dictatorship with the support of the local elite multinational corporations and the CIA. And this would officially last until 1983. Many scholars argue that this dictatorship was not an anomaly, but the escalation of existing processes to eradicate groups that did not fit into Argentina's cultural or political status quo, which was defined by the country's patriarchal culture, specifically one rooted in whiteness. This culture influenced, this culture and its influence rendered the experience of many victims of marginalized identities invisible and perpetuated what the dictatorship had so violently attempted to do. It's believed that during this period of authoritarianism to restore order to the country, 30,000 people were disappeared as a form of mass terror. Unsurprisingly, this state terror has deeply impacted the people of Argentina, and they continue to work to heal from it. While trials have been held against perpetrators of the dictatorship, justice remains incomplete. In 2016, Jorge Julio Lopez was disappeared for a second time as he prepared to testify against the man who had tortured him when he was first disappeared in the 1970s. By analyzing the altered image of Lopez created in 2016 by he was disappeared in 2006, I misspoke. By analyzing the altered image of Lopez created in 2016 by political front La Brecha, which calls attention to injustice in times of democracy, as well as by reviewing existing literature on the dictatorship in Argentina, I examined the lack of visibility regarding the experiences of victims of state terror. Seeing how this violence has been perpetuated in Argentine society, I argue that the violent marginalization of certain identities by the state can be understood not just as part of the dictatorship, but as existing outside the years 1976 to 1983, and relating to larger questions of justice and memory. Using the image of Lopez, I will first talk about the rise of the idea of subversion in Argentina, then state terror during the dictatorship, and finally Argentina's process of recovery. To kind of explain this image here, at the top it says 10 years without Jorge Julio Lopez. Each desaparecer means to disappear. On the far left, you have him with the hat. That's Jorge Julio Lopez himself. It says como testigo en juicio a genocidas, him as a witness. Next is como mujeres por la trata, sex trafficked women. Next is como les pibes de los barrios. Those are young people, specifically from low-income neighborhoods, who are often victims of police brutality and labeled as delinquents. Next is como las trabas, which are like trans people, and specifically this identity travesti, which is distinct from transgender but similar. Next is como los pueblos originarios, the indigenous peoples of Argentina, and finally como les piqueteres. Piqueteres are people who lost all form of income in Argentina's economic downfall of the 1990s and are kind of like career activists to demand that the state helps Argentina's most economically marginalized. At the bottom, it says, pasan los gobiernos, continúa la impunidad. Governments pass, impunity continues. During the latter half of the 20th century, the social mobilization that had arisen in response to economic stagnation in Argentina post-World War II was met with political repression, creating massive unrest and radicalization among the population. Argentines had found themselves in a state of desperation without a visible solution in the established rules of their society, and they began to engage in direct action, including the formation of armed guerrilla groups. Although they constituted only a relatively small portion of the population, these guerrillas on the left became understood as the utmost threat to Argentine society and served as the justification for the terrorizing of the nation. Seen as not only a political threat, but also a threat to Argentina's social fabric through their gender deviance, the embodiment of the threat of subversion was the figure of the guerrilla woman, who had, quote, lost any trace of humankind and of womanhood, left with only the empty body of a woman, end quote, which demonstrates how violence against women deemed subversive was justified by the military and its supporters. In 1974, 2 years before the military coup, there was only one newspaper reporting on the gender dynamics of repression. This newspaper was linked to a guerrilla group, the Montoneros, and they specifically reported on rape being used as a weapon against female militants. In La Brecha's image of Lopez, we see the identities of people who are viewed as problems in Argentina. The placement of the image of a sex-trafficked woman atop that of a disappeared man suggests that Argentina's patriarchy still devalues women's humanity. We're therefore encouraged to think about how this idea of empty bodies still exists during democratic rule. Though they are found in distinct contexts, trafficked women have been invisibilized in Argentine society and reduced to their bodies in the justification of exploitation and violence, which we can understand as part of a larger issue of gender inequality by seeing how Argentine society perceived militant women. Jorge Julio Lopez was an activist, first part of a radical leftist group, and then after the dictatorship, part of the formerly detained and disappeared persons group. This made him a threat to the regime. In her book, Disappearing Acts, Diana Taylor provides more insight as to how the military viewed criminality. Well, in a cruel inversion of the Tree of Life, the Air Force Academy of Buenos Aires drew up a tree of subversion with 47 branches representing various crimes. The crimes range from progressive Catholicism to Protestantism to Judaism, from alcoholism to prostitution to divorce and homosexuality, from human rights to women's rights and pacifism. Any not covered by a specific branch fell into branch 16, others. Furthermore, anyone associated with or sympathetic to this expanding and amorphous group of subversives might well become the next victim. While unfortunately I could not find an image of this tree of subversion, we can see how the concept of subversion was inclusive and dynamic, yet intentionally vague, leaving nearly every Argentine vulnerable to being a victim of the regime's violence. While the image of Lopez has been made in a modern context, people of the identities depicted would have been deemed subversive by the dictatorship. Sex workers are the sexually exploited, delinquents, travestis, and trans people, indigenous peoples, and protesters. In this reconfiguration of Lopez's image, La Brecha aims to call attention not only to how issues of violence and repression persist, but how they exist and intersect across different identities. Interestingly, during the dictatorship, activism was also common among women on the right, yet they were political in a way that was deemed proper by the regime because they had a concern for protecting the family from subversion. Activism is more widely accepted when coming from women who, in all other respects, embody traditional gender norms. Though they did face violence and repression by the state, the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, a group made up of mothers of the disappeared and arguably Argentina's strongest activist group, gained the sympathies of the Argentine public in finding their disappeared children by asserting their motherhood. Political prisons and clandestine detention centers served as spaces where women were supposed to be rehabilitated into their traditional roles. However, this was really superficial. They instead empowered military men in their performance of masculinity as they worked to undo these women prisoners' subjectivities through acts such as rape, shaving their heads, withholding hygiene products, and a lot of other hauntingly innovative forms of torture that I'm not going to talk about. It is important to note, however, that in addition to luck, a sense of connection and solidarity was what enabled women to survive detainment. Women practiced resistance against their oppressors and in cooperation with one another. Despite the violence committed against these women, the state never succeeded in their goal of rehabilitating them. And prisons became places that fostered a communal culture of resistance based on political agency and cultural exchange. As a way of coping with state terror, many Argentines denied the disappearances, even giving rise to the term precepticide, or they rationalized them, even though most victims were not violent guerrillas as the dictatorship wanted them to believe. In its attempt at justice for victims of state terror, the government only prosecuted crimes that violated the laws established by the military regime without questioning the legality of the regime itself, which was started by an inherently illicit military coup. This has made for a difficult and complex process of recovery, leaving many victims unseen or dismissed by Argentina's new democratic government, including women who experienced sexual assault. These crimes were understood not as part of a larger violent exploitative system, but of the perversion of a few individuals. It was in part changes to international law following periods of immense violence and repression elsewhere, such as in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, that rape would be considered a crime against humanity in the context of the dictatorship. In spite of extreme repression and pain, however, there were always people who spoke out against and denounced the regime. Many of those who were victims of state terror had already been or would become activists. Regarding the work of La Brecha as a national collective of diverse activist groups, Kolbrisky claims, La Brecha's interventions are designed to hacer ruido, or make noise, within a human rights environment dominated in part by the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, and Hijos, the children of the disappeared, whose predominance at times limits the potential of activist visual culture, such as photography of the disappeared, by fixing the disappeared as a stock group of subjects targeted during the dictatorship. As a result, visual culture images of the disappeared have come to form a static archive whose meaning has calcified. La Brecha thus attempts to disrupt this activist imagery's meaning in part by introducing new subjects and re-signifying disappearance. In 2012, Argentina passed its gender identity law, and in 2018, a historic ruling in the province of Santa Fe expanded economic reparations for trans women and travestis illegally detained during the dictatorship. This marks the recognition of victims of the dictatorship due to gender identity, in addition to political affiliations, union involvement, and status as students, which had already been acknowledged. This legislation both acknowledges and opens up more space for people of marginalized gender identities to pursue legal justice in Argentina's process of recovery. The authoritarian period in Argentina was one defined by state terror, largely due to the country's patriarchal culture and the goals of its last dictatorship to uphold and even intensify this culture, making people of marginalized identities particularly vulnerable not only to violence, but to invisibility. While I primarily looked at women's experiences very broadly in my research, I realized that within and across these identities, this identity lies more distinctions. The dictatorship was characterized by the intensification of existing cultural phenomena, and considering the dictatorship's celebration of the military's 19th century conquest of the land and its attempted extermination of indigenous peoples. For example, it was not only people who identified as women who felt the dictatorship's impacts. This makes the image by La Brecha of desaparecido Jorge Julio Lopez and activism with an intersectional focus particularly relevant. While growing in popularity, scholarship on gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity related to the dictatorship is limited. It is therefore critical that scholars continue to ask questions and investigate how Argentina's marginalized identities, and particularly how they intersect, may have left them especially vulnerable to the violent repression of the dictatorship and its persistence in Argentina's return to democracy. If we demand nunca más, never again, then we must work to gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of the dictatorship and why its project has so successfully been a part of Argentine society, as well as where we notice these same processes elsewhere, including here at home. Thank you for listening. Any questions, I guess?
Maybe a overflow of questions? Are you?
Oh, Maya?
In your time in Argentina, how do you see this, press trauma and
Yeah, so for me, it was very interesting because I lived with a host family in Argentina. Well, it was really just a host mom, but she was a lot more conservative. She had grown up higher class, and for her, she experienced a lot of violence on the part of guerrillas, which kind of like shifted her perception of the violence during this period. And in my opinion, made her a bit dismissive of like the like what it means to have your state, your government like terrorize your entire country, as opposed to just like a few groups of people who decide to get together and commit violence. So that was very interesting to me because I had learned a little bit about this before going to Argentina in my classes here at Western, and it hadn't really sunken in until I went there that like there were different ways of looking at this, and that like really got to me. It like really messed with my mind. So yeah, that has become something that I would want to continue studying. I don't know if that answers your question.
Struck by your comment in the conclusion about needing to look at this more broadly as well. And in the beginning, you were talking about the CIA support for dictatorship, which was not at all uncommon globally at that time, nor for that matter now. And so I'm wondering, as you're looking at the Never Again, are you looking, how are you thinking about the global factors, and especially the US as very influential in maintaining dictatorships in many cases?
Yeah, in terms of that, I can mostly speak to like my journey personally as someone from the US. I think that it's really important. As I said, my capstone project for the Honors College is going to be on the Parque de la Memoria, which means memory park in Spanish. And that was really instrumental for me in understanding this dictatorship, and I felt really important that I go to as someone from the US. And when my mom, for example, came to visit me when I was studying abroad in Argentina, I made sure to take her to museums about the dictatorship, because she, even though she was growing up during this period, just had no idea what was going on. So I think like for a lot of us, this comes in the form of education, and wanting to make sure that we hold our government accountable as much as possible, and that we don't unintentionally contribute to continuing this.
Yes.
So our second presentation is also, I believe, is coming out of Professor Monson's class. And so I will let Professor Monson do the introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. The End of Scholars Week made it for the last presentation, so great job, everyone. Yeah, so Luke was in my 490 in winter, and that was called Earliest Art and Culture.
If you can get it, yeah.
And I named it that so I would get more cultural anthropologists, and Luke is one of those cultural anthropologists, so that worked. And it's working even more because now he works in my lab, so I'm slowly dragging him over into more of the bio side of things. But the goal for that class is really to help students develop their writing skills on a topic of their choice. And it's related to art and culture in some way, and we'll hear about this topic on art. But it was just, his paper really exemplified what I'm looking for from students, where he just showed a lot of improvement, order, and produced a paper that was really well cited, had a lot of references, really well formatted, it had good logic, structure, and the topic was super interesting. So for me, I'm really trying to help students develop those skills, and he really epitomized that with this paper. So I hope you all enjoy learning about art against tyranny from the book.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no worries. Terribly sorry about this.
He also has a poster hanging in the wall.
Oh, yeah, if you want to check out something on, let's see, the Haitian origin of zombies and how that connects to the present day. I have a poster about that, but for now, this presentation is called Art Against Tyranny. This was from Dr. Munson's earliest arts and culture class, and it's looking at Ukraine's resistance of occupation through cultural expression. So in this presentation, I'll cover everything that was covered in my paper, the important background information behind the war and the role of East Slavic culture, which contains both Russian, Belarus, and Ukrainian culture within it. Following that, how cultural turmoil and conflict affects artistic expression, and how that can be analyzed in looking at how people use art to showcase their own resistance against occupation. After that, I will connect all of that back to the modern Ukrainian conflict and why this analysis of art is important and necessary in understanding the current conflict in Ukraine. Then finally, I will showcase my discussions and the conclusion of this research. So for the background, this the invasion of Ukraine is nothing new in suppressing Ukrainian history by Russia. The first attempt was under Tsarist Russia. Peter the Great took Ukrainian culture as Russia's own in order to attempt to appeal to European powers at the time and give Russia more of a foothold within the rest of Europe. And then, of course, as the Soviet Union came to power, this completely flip-flopped. All outside culture was heavily suppressed within the Soviet Union, and therefore Ukrainians did not have an outlet to display their culture. And then now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation is once again trying to claim Ukrainian culture as Russia's own, which is simply not true. Even though all of these East Slavic cultures share a root in the city-state of Kievan Rus, they have diverged since Mongol invasion led to the destruction of that state and the arising of very independent nations from that root. And then this is especially dangerous when claimed by Russia because they are actively using this false claim that Ukrainian culture is a part of Russian culture to suppress Ukraine, to invade Ukraine, and to basically remove everything Ukrainians hold here and their sovereignty. So through all of this, though, the nation's artists have remained steadfast in the face of opposition, expressing their own culture proudly despite outright hostility to its existence. Their culture has persevered despite these constant strains, despite Russia taking it under the Tsarist name to appeal to Western Europe. It has survived through USSR attempts to censor the nation's art, and it will survive through the current conflict. So with this in mind, I chose art as an important piece to analyze and bring that perspective on the role of art in this Ukrainian conflict to Western audiences. So art allows people to showcase their culture in defiance of those who suppress them. The Russian establishment under all of those forms has suppressed Ukrainian culture, and it has had devastating impacts, including lost lives and destroyed homes. But culture isn't destroyed easily. These cultures live on even when they have to be reshaped and recontextualized to deal with new traumas and the objectification of their own lives and culture. So this art is from refugees from Crimea after Russia's annexation of the state in 2014. And it actually shows how they, using materials found in Germany, reconstructed their own memories, recreated their own photos from their past, but they importantly removed Russia's role from those photos. If a photo, say, involved something where a member of the family was taken by the Russian government, they would, when they're describing these photos, completely remove that. The family member would have left for other reasons because they want to make sure Russia does not have a place in defining their narratives and their history. So cultural expression is malleable both by those who are trying to suppress art and by those who are resisting that suppression. So with Peter the Great's attempt to reform East Slavic culture into an all Russian culture and taking Ukrainian art. That was one of the earliest examples of using the malleability of art to change it. And then in the Soviet Union, this was another example where Ukrainian artists themselves had to reshape their own art in order to get past that Soviet scrutiny and that censorship of their own art, because they weren't able to showcase their own art within their own country, because there were fears that if Ukrainians started to understand their own culture within the Soviet Union, there would be calls for the end of the Soviet Union, which eventually came to pass. And again, these artists who are steadfast enough to resist that suppression are the whole reason that so much of Ukrainian culture still survives today, because even inside the nation, they had to resist that oppression, but outside the nation, they brought that art to the rest of Europe and were able to showcase it there while the Soviet Union suppressed any internal expression of culture. And then protests to oppression showcased how powerful cultural resistance and adaptability was, especially through art. So the Russian government was so against Ukrainians showcasing their own art because they were afraid that if all the satellite states in the Soviet Union gained an understanding of their own culture, that it would lead to calls for the end of the Soviet Union. And this eventually came to pass as all these Ukrainian artists were able to, with Glasnost and loosening of these restrictions, as they're able to discover their own culture and showcase their own art, there were increased calls for the fall of the Soviet Union. And this ended up happening as more people understood their own history and made demands that the Soviet Union could no longer suppress their own culture. So, and then looking at this globally, cultural conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it will always be seen by the world. However, this response is a lot more subtle in the case of art. So often there was full complacency to suppression in the art, as Ukrainian works were heavily critiqued when they're shown to the rest of Europe because they were other, and there wasn't an understanding of both the fact that Ukrainians had their own complex artistic culture that was separate from Russia, but also the fact that Ukrainian art had been shaped by Western influence as it existed between Russia and Western Europe, and it was exposed to more of those Western influences during Peter the Great's reign when it was used to showcase Slavic culture to the rest of Europe. And when the October Revolution happened and artists were fleeing the nation because of these fears of suppression of their culture, these correct fears that their culture would be suppressed under the Soviet Union, this in that they got from this understanding in the West gave them a chance because individuals and institutions within Western Europe were willing to take in Ukrainian art and take in Ukrainian artists. And even if there was a lack of understanding there, it was still essential to the survival of Ukrainian art, because if these institutions were willing to look closer and understand the long history of strife and turmoil and independence behind Ukrainian art, they would get an understanding of what Ukrainians had been through and support their calls for independence more. So again, this interest started when Peter the Great introduced Ukrainian culture abroad as Russia's own. It later helped Ukrainian artists as they fled the Soviet Union, as stated before, and because there was interest and understanding of the art. Though this was essential to the survival of Ukrainian art, there was so much misunderstanding of this art in Europe because critics were interested in it, because they perceived it as other, because they really wanted to comprehend art that came from a place that wasn't their own as something very other and distinct and often lesser than their own art, without this understanding of both Ukrainian art as something very strong, very independent, and very complex, but also shared some Western European influences as it was exposed more to Western Europe under Peter the Great's rule. And these artists did also have to adapt to these perceptions laid upon them in order to make sure that their art was able to survive outside of the Soviet Union. One group actually went as far as calling themselves the Scythians after an East Slavic steppe nomad group in order to really kind of, and to an extent, embrace this perception of otherness to allow their own art to survive outside of Ukraine. And then analyzing this private exchange is important to understanding preservation and displacement of cultural artifacts from those they belong to, because many Kiev and Rus artifacts, including these pendants that I analyzed in my literature review, went through many public and private hands after they were discovered, and eventually, even though many of them ended up within Ukraine itself, a lot of them ended up in foreign museums such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other places. And we really need to analyze and consider what it means that these artifacts exist outside of where they belong. And that's a lot harder to analyze with the current context of the war going on, because there is, to an extent, more survival of cultural artifacts if they are outside the nation and safe from the effects of war. But after the war ends, it really needs to be dealt with that these artifacts belong in the place that they started, and there should be discussion about bringing artifacts back to Ukraine. And this does not just exist in pendants and things created before the Soviet Union, because Ukrainian artists who showcased their art in the Soviet Union showcased it because the government would only allow it to be showcased to foreign buyers and to expose it to outside sources, so it wasn't brought back into Ukraine. So art was commoditized as a form of suppression of Ukrainian culture, as it was monetized to make sure it didn't get back into Ukraine under the Soviet Union. And these are actually pictures of me going and seeing those artifacts. So long story short, during spring break, I was in New York State because my brother got a job at the New York State Water Department. So we went up as a family to visit him, and then we went down to New York City, and my parents asked, okay, do you want to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or do you want to go to the Museum of Natural History? And the little bit of bioanth in me was like, oh, Museum of Natural History would be so cool. But then I thought, wait a minute, some of the artifacts I looked at in my paper actually were housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I decided to go there, and I actually got to see these artifacts, which is really cool because I've been doing this research for so long, and so much of it just felt like, you know, reading papers and taking sources back into a collective literature review. So it was really cool to actually see some of this in person and really understand that research exists in the real world. So with the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the first time Ukrainians could explore their own culture independently, and outside and external influence were paramount in how they shaped their culture. There was this very long history of both Eastern and Western influences how Ukrainians shaped their culture, but in the past, this was always defined by Russia. Russia was the state that controlled Ukraine for a long time, so they utilized both Western and Eastern influences for their own end, using Western influences to showcase Ukrainian art outside of Greater Russia and the Soviet Union, and also utilizing that Eastern influence to make sure Ukraine was not able to look at its own cultural history and its own influences from outside the Soviet Union. And as Ukraine became independent of the Soviet Union, they really, for the first time in history, were able to fully develop their own culture for themselves without all this outside influence that for so long had affected how they define their own culture. So this was a really good moment in Ukrainian history for their cultural independence. But then, of course, in February 24th of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and once again attempted to suppress their own culture and devastated families and lives along the way. So there is a long history why this is necessary to understand in the sense of the current conflict. Is there is a long history of culture suppression in the East Slavic world, and understanding this is essential to understanding the current conflict. So Ukraine has resisted occupation and cultural suppression for so long, and before the idea of an independent Ukrainian culture even existed, and nothing is going to stop them from doing this now that they've been able to express their own culture freely, and they will continue to do so. The fact, and it has made Ukrainian culture stronger because they have been able to express their own culture freely for so long. because both internally and externally, their independence has been cemented. So again, internally, you have the idea that they can now express their own culture, but externally, after all of those outside influences, after Ukrainians fled the Soviet Union and showcased their art within the rest of Europe and around the world, there is a greater understanding that Ukrainian art and Ukrainian culture is something fully unique from Russia and is something that they will not let Russia define again. And actually, Professor Vida, who is the head, one of the linguistics professors here and the head of the Russian language program, I actually talked to him about this presentation. And an interesting note is that he really compared this moment in Ukrainian history to kind of, from a cultural standpoint, really similar to the American Revolutionary War, because it was the first time that the country really came together as a unified force in order to counteract outside influence. Because even after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were still parts of Ukraine that were more aligned with Russia and even spoke Russian as the main language and really embraced a lot of Russian culture. But as Russia invaded Ukraine, there were more calls for a unified Ukrainian independence, because now they fully identified themselves as their own culture, because they needed to resist Russia's influence and Russia's attempt to take their own culture, their own home, and their own lives away from them. And then lastly, just looking at why art itself is so instrumental to understanding this, because art is foundational to culture. And looking at art itself showcases how people have Russian. Ukrainians created this art mainly for themselves to showcase their own history and their own stories, but they also made it for other Ukrainians so that they as a collective could understand their own cultural history, and for the rest of the world so that everyone could understand that they were an independent culture and they would not be suppressed any longer. So through this analysis too, you see how long-standing Ukrainians have shown their own independence to Russia, even when Russia defines so much of their narrative. Through the USSR, even though the culture was heavily suppressed, they showcased art. They still persevered and made art to defy the Soviet Union's influence, even if they had to change it to make sure it got past Soviet censorship, but also make sure that foreign audiences had interest in the art. Whether it was traditional paintings or whether it was works created by refugees to showcase their own narrative and how important that is when talking about Ukraine, they made this artwork so they, as Ukrainians and the rest of the world, could understand who they are and that Russia would not define that. So in concluding, this narrative is important to help global audiences understand the conflict, because in the news and in media, there's so much attention brought to the Ukrainian conflict, but there's very, very little understanding in most Western audiences of the long history of Ukraine and Russia and all of the conflict behind that. There is understanding of the USSR to an extent, but especially before that with Tsarist Russia and all those influences, there's just very little understanding of that in the Western world. And then using this art is really important because it lets Ukrainians themselves tell their own stories and tell their own narratives without Russia's influence, because by looking at that influence, you can see how they define their own culture for themselves without that Western bias towards what it is and without Russia's censorship defining what it is. Culture is important to everyone, and by being who you are sending a very powerful message to people who want to suppress everything you hold dear. Ukraine's strength against tyranny is an example for the rest of the world that you can never let anyone take your culture and everything you love that it stands for. And with that, I'd just like to give a few special thanks to Tesla Munson for the nomination of this paper and guiding my writing and making sure the paper I turned in for that class was the best it could be. If anyone needs a capstone class, Earliest Arts and Culture was a fantastic class. Could not recommend it enough. I would also like to thank Edward Vida for engaging my interest in Slavic culture and giving me resources and advice for this paper and beyond. He actually lent me a book that was very instrumental to understanding the Tsarist Russia's influence in Ukraine, and that became foundational to a lot of this research because there was a lot of that history that even when I was looking at this, I mainly looked at the USSR perspective, but that really brought into terms how important pre-USSR Tsarist Russia was in suppression of Ukraine's culture. And then Fiona Felker for giving me advice on how to make this presentation and just help inside and outside of class. I'm sorry I didn't make it dark mode. That was very late in the process of making this. And I was like, I don't think I can fit that in. And then everyone who was in that Anthropology 490 class, we had a workshop day where all of us got together and gave feedback on each other's papers. And that was super helpful to making sure my paper was as good as it could be. I'm really grateful to all of you. And then to everyone who's here today, friends, family, faculty, students, and everyone else, thank you so much for coming. It really means a lot to me that you showed up to see my work. Any questions?
We'll have time after the presentations at the reception,
Awesome.
immediately afterwards. I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity for Professor Malloy to come up and talk a little bit about the paper that is not being presented today because the authors of the paper were unable to join us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, probably, you want to mic?
Oh.
We'll mic you so that, yes. And this is quite brief and not a
Yes.
presentation in any way of the paper itself. One of the things I really love about this award is that it is all of the subdisciplines submitting to the same group and everyone reviewing everyone's. And it reminds us of the four field, the strength of four fields of our discipline, that we are not divided, we join these things together. So I especially appreciate Professor Monson's class and bringing the culturals over to the dark side, perhaps of bio. We'll bring the bio over to the dark side of cultural, or, you know, some people can come both. We're back in cultural again, very
Yes.
briefly to talk about the third of the papers that won the award this year.
Thank you. I'll just quickly say thanks for the previous two presentations. They were really terrific. And I just did a lesson on art in my cultural anthropology intro class today and wish I had your paper as a case study. So maybe we could chat for next lesson. So I taught a 490 as well in the fall, and it was anthropology and / of settler colonialism. And for the first half of the quarter, we really looked at anthropology and settler colonialism to understand the role that anthropology has played in shaping colonial contexts, and also how critical Indigenous scholarship has addressed that relationship. And then we spent the second half with the anthropology of settler colonialism to say, how can the tools of cultural anthropology, particularly ethnography, be used to examine how settler colonialism continues to play out in our lives today. And through the class, students read a lot of different pieces by both anthropologists and Indigenous scholars, and we spent a lot of time connecting the content to this region in particular. And many of the students, all of the students are non-Indigenous in that class, as am I, and many of the students in the class would ask questions about, why didn't I understand this history before? How did I not really know colonial history in this region if they'd grown up here in Washington State? And so for the two people that I nominated, they worked together on a research proposal to try to use anthropology tools to answer that question. Why did they and their peers not grow up understanding these histories, and what can be done in the education, what is being done and what could be done in the education system to rectify that? So Peyton and Lila work together. I invited students if they wanted to work on their research proposal as a collaborative process, and they chose to do that. And they were terrific collaborators. They worked really well together. They did a very extensive literature review, and I challenged students to really think about their citational praxis. Who are they citing and why? Who is helping them to think differently or deeply about the issues that they're looking at? And they really conveyed a lot of depth in that work in their research proposal. And so ultimately they created a proposal to study local school systems and to work with local educators who are working on since time immemorial curriculum implementation, and specifically non-Indigenous settler teachers' professional development. They were really inspired by Dolores Calderon, a professor in Fairhaven, and Annalise, professor in Woodring, who've worked with two educators at Illumination, Renee Swan-Waite and Cynthia Wilson, to do some settler teacher professional development work. And so they proposed a project to build off of that work, to continue that work, and to try to answer this question of like, why didn't they understand this? What could be known? What could make education better, more place-based, more place-connected? I'll just share two more things. One is that they took my participatory action research class last quarter, and they had to write a theory of change assignment about, you know, their own positionalities, their own ideas of change making in action contexts, and they chose to work together on that assignment again, and they did a podcast, and it was a very sweet thing. I didn't get their permission to play their podcast, but I wish I could because it was wonderful. And in it, they talked about how they had proposed a participatory action research project in 490 without even realizing it. And then when they were in the PAR class, they got a little bit more language about methods, and were able to kind of further build on that work. And the reason that they're not here today is that they're in a Salish Sea Studies class, and they probably are on Lopez Island right now for their lab. So they're really continuing that place-based work that they started in the class. So that's them. I'd like to celebrate them. Thank you.
We do get to celebrate, I'll go ahead and take, because we get to celebrate somewhere in here. I have certificates, I believe.
Oh.
That we, don't I? We make thing. The award for these papers is in fact a monetary award, and that goes into your student account for the students who are winners of the award. But we also have a lovely suitable for framing certificate to recognize this and to give you a reminder as you're working on your Vita and you did this. This is a thing. That I think lasts longer than the money necessarily. So if I could have Luke and Lily come up. Everyone, you again, congratulations. Okay, let's get the, yeah. There we go. And then if we could turn the light on, there we go. Yeah. So that's what I would like to do is I'll go ahead and hand Lily her certificate.
Yeah.
And then I'll just trade you guys places real quick. And then, congratulations. And we do have certificates also for the other students. And I wanted to point out that, and I thought I had another one, but I don't. Okay. I wanted to point out that one of the things that I think is so wonderful about this is that it isn't restricted to a particular class, and that none of these projects are restricted to a class, and none of the papers that have been presented, or for that matter, the vast majority of the posters that I've seen, are all things that transcend 1 quarter and 10 weeks and an assignment. And I'm so pleased that we are able to once again have this celebration of undergraduate research, because undergraduate research is not a lesser form of research. And in this department, we feel that undergraduate education needs to include actual pursuit of your own inquiry questions. And we have got so many wonderful examples over the last 2 days of that process. I hope anybody who is not graduating is keeping in mind that this is something that you should be thinking about doing next year. And that participating in these opportunities to be part of the research community is so important and so vital. The conference itself could not have happened, however, without the willing and energetic assistance of Jack Tillman. So I want to bring him up here. And I'm using a personalized certificate. I don't appear to have a certificate, but there would be. a certificate, and I think that I will get support from the entire Anthropology Club in that as well, yes. That this conference owes so much to Jack's work, not just this year, but last year, trying to get the thing going after COVID. And as it continues, I think that his influence will continue to be part of this program. So thank you very much, Jack. And now we all get to adjourn and have food and drink and interact with one another. Please feel free to go out to the tables and then bring stuff back in here. Or be out in the hallway. I think it's a little cooler in here than the hallway. I'm not entirely sure.
All right.
Wherever in school or.